What's happening, everyone? Welcome to the Perfect Balance podcast. This is the first episode. We're going to get the ball rolling straight away. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you do know when we drop more content, whether it's fitness videos, shorts, or more podcasts to come. So, in this very first episode, I just want to discuss training styles and the main theme being Westside training. So if you know me and you know me personally, I like to do CrossFit style of training, and I tend to lean towards the Olympic lifting style of training due to the fact of the gym limitations that I'm in. So I'm currently training in a commercial gym, and if you if you are in a commercial gym, you'll know you're very limited to some of the functional kit which is used in CrossFit. So there's no pegboards, there's no ropes to do rope climbs, there's no rings to do ring muscle ups or anything like that. So I tend to lean to more towards more the Olympic weightlifting side of things, which I enjoy the most now post gymnastics career. But one of the big things in earlier on in my CrossFit journey was the big glaring week was the Olympic lifting, hence um, the reason for going into the deep dive and the rabbit hole of Louie Simmons's Westside Barbell. It was recommended probably about 6, 7 years ago now by an old coach of mine who had a big background in powerlifting. He also gave me advice on changing my diet up from a high protein diet, which is what you need in the gymnastics world, to a more increased in carbs, trying to get a little bit more body mass because mass moves mass. So that was interesting. And from there, that's where I dove into Louie Simmons and what really Westside Barbell was all about. Um, so I remember seeing one of the first videos I ever seen was, I think, an old grainy video of your typical American sort of uh, rough gym. It was it was a hardcore gym. You could see it was a hardcore gym full of hardcore guys, big guys that were just relentless. And at first, I thought, I'm not going to get results from this. There's no way these guys don't have a clue. But the more you look into it, and the more you looked into Louis' backgrounds and teachings, the more the puzzle came together, and the pieces of the jigsaw just fell in place. And that's what was great about Louis, was that I'd highly recommend, first of all, you go and watch Westside versus the World. I think there is a copy on YouTube somewhere, but I'd highly recommend you go and watch that. And Louis always backs up what he says by the science, by journals, by, first of all, from his own deep dive, was through old papers from the Soviet Union. So I think he got papers and research from, and I'm going to do my best to explain this off the top of my head as well, is from the old Dynamo Club, from research papers of the old Soviet Union weightlifting, which was basically the secrets to him being able to build a successful powerlifting gym. He just realized that he had to reverse things for powerlifting, because powerlifting, you need to be able to lift way higher in terms of weights. They need to be able to be used to lifting high levels of weights slower, versus Olympic lifting with heavy weights but at fast speed. It's a speed strength sport in Olympic lifting, which for me personally in my career, being weak at Olympic lifting heavy weights, is sort of a huge weakness and a huge coming out of gymnastics. And I'll touch on this in a separate podcast or a separate video, where the strength conditioning side of gymnastics needs to be, I wouldn't say revolutionized, but tweaked a little bit in terms of certain exercises for certain parts of the body that will allow for a massive amount of strength increase and things like that. Because yeah, I'll revert back to that later on in this podcast. But Louis had gone away in, it's probably the mid 70s, and he'd researched the Russian papers, and he basically took away the basically the training style of what the Soviet Union were doing from the Olympic lifting side of things back then, and adapted it to his own powerlifting. And one of the things he emphasizes on is a conjugate system. So a conjugate is always changing. It's different. It's to basically shock the CNS and to shock a new stimulus to the body. Therefore, always making new records, having countless amounts of records. Now, having done this personally, I'm not sure how big it is in the CrossFit world. I know there is one CrossFit box I know of that's using Westside Barbell's methodology, which is great to see, and I think they have tons of results all the time. And the notion is that you pick an exercise, you run a 3-week wave of that. You basically work in your weaknesses depending on which exercise it is. So to explain that further, the bigger breakdown across the week is 2 max efforts. So one is upper, one is lower. 2 dynamic days. Again, one is upper, one is lower. Then you've got a repetition day, which is essentially your special exercises, your bodybuilding exercises, the exercises that you really need to blow up in the muscle groups that are weak. So let's say you've got a weak pull and it's from the knees that you're always failing at the max effort. It could be that you've got a weak lower back, so you need to do loads of back extensions. So that day in particular is to really focus on during the repetition day. It also allows for basically an active recovery day. A lot of programs that I've done have basically an active recovery day. They don't call it that, but it is that. It's a day off the weights. It's a day off shocking the CNS. It's just to allow you to keep active, but allow you to recover so that the following day you can get back to it again, which is good. I don't mind that as long as you're not just resting. I think again this is something that Louie picked up on along his journey during powerlifting, and I'll touch on that with competitions. But um, when it came to splitting the days like that, so you would try not to do your max efforts back to back. So you want to do, for example, on Monday it would be max lower, Tuesday would be dynamic upper, a Wednesday would be a repetition day, and then you would do a dynamic lower, say, or your max effort upper, and you're sort of keeping the max effort days sort of separated with allowing, I think it's at least 48 hours recovery, just to get a true max effort and hopefully break a record every couple of weeks. And the theory is that if you can break a record every three weeks, what's going to happen in 3 months or 6 months to a year? The idea is you just keep pushing, 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 and pushing, never hitting really a plateau. So there's so much to cover, and as I've touched on before, Westside Barbell, Westside versus the World really breaks down the history of not only Louie but the guys that trained under Louie and the sort of notions of his philosophy and where his philosophy come, which I've just explained through the old Soviet Union training. But one of the big things that I picked up on along during my fitness journey was that one interview that stood out a lot was, I think it was Travis Mash, who's an Olympic weightlifter, and he was on the Joe Rogan podcast probably about 6-7 years ago now as well. And that was American weightlifting back then was not doing good. There was no CJ Cummins. There was no stars, as Louis calls it. There was no one to look up to. And Olympic weightlifting alongside CrossFit sort of went obviously hand in hand, but blew up big time. And it really gave popularity back in the US especially. So at that time, Louis basically just said that the coaches were basically being stubborn in that they would keep the training styles very similar in terms of they would only work on the classical lifts, being the clean and jerk, the snatch. They do a front squat and a back squat, and that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. Maybe a power snatch, maybe a power clean. That's pretty much it. There was no block work. There was no sort of pin work for a squat. There was no starting at a weakened point and trying to push through. There was no jerk recovery work. These are all max efforts as well. These are all different records that these elite athletes, don't forget, these are elite athletes at the time, were not working. And China was, I mean, China still are, still killing it. And people watch their videos and they're climbing under 400-pound weight and just standing up with a squat jerk start. And they're only weighing like 73 kilos, 70 kilos, 69 kilos, which is just phenomenal. It's crazy. But Louis' argument at the time was that we weren't producing any athletes because we would stick to linear progression, which is as old as dawn as time. If you're in the strength conditioning world, you basically overload a little bit, you sort of see a continuous sort of progression is the idea, which works, particularly if you're a newbie. If you're into fitness or you've just got into weights, you see newbie gains quite quickly, and linear progression, straightforward progression is great for beginners and intermediates, but not so much the elites. And yeah, with that came a bit of an uproar at the time, which you can imagine because no one likes to hear someone from outside your own sport basically demonizing your coaching and your ways of teaching your athletes. But I'm on the favor of what Louis had put forward, because one, he's trying to ignite a spark and to get people to come visit him and to get people to educate themselves in the fact that where he learned his sort of methodologies and basic principles was from Soviet Union style of training from the 50s, 60s, 70s and beyond. So if it works for him, why wouldn't it work for the US weightlifting coaches or CrossFit coaches, etc., etc.? And like I say, he was demonized at the time. He got a lot of backlash, and I think there was only Travis Marsh and maybe a few other coaches that went down to visit Westside Barbell and went down to take, and they even took some of their own Olympic lifting athletes. And from what I remember, it was a great eye opener for them and a great education for them. But yeah, you can find that on YouTube, the Travis Mash podcast with Louie Simmons. But when it comes to my own journey, I've taken on the conjugate system, and I have found that it's rapidly helped my strength. And I'm a natural lifter in terms of, I've not taken any PDs or anything like that to enhance my lifts or anything. Louis had spoken about, if you're a raw natural lifter, you should be spending no more than 45 minutes to an hour in a gym session. And I think where people, if you are a regular fitness gym goer and you're still trying to push for the elite percentage side of, in particular, CrossFit, so if you're in the top 3% in the UK and you're doing well in the open, but your strength's not improving, a lot of the times I found personally was that they wouldn't include what Louis had sort of taught in his podcasts or in his videos, and that a lot of the times it tended to be that they were getting programmed the same movements, like what Louis had said with the American weightlifting team. Even now, even in 2024, I'm still got close friends, close circles that are saying to me that they've not PR'd in a year plus. And I remember not long before the pandemic, and there was a few weightlifters in the gym that I was at, and it was frustrating, and it was a plateau that was a long-term plateau. And I I remember asking one of them at the time, and I said to him, "Do you do any plyometrics? Do you do any sort of speed work?" And he said, "Well, I do power snatch and I do power cleans and I do from the blocks, and which was all weight related and it was percentage related, which is fine, but there was no jumps, there was no plyometrics, and plyometrics can, when you're hitting, when you're really pushing your genetics and you're pushing your top end weights, you as I said at the start of the podcast, you need to shock your body, you need to shock the stimulus into reacting faster, moving quicker. But people don't think like even coaches in the UK and in the US, they don't think how they can do that. They'll program the basic set exercise at the barbell, and they'll claim, well, it's got to be specific, and it has got to be specific. But again, go back to the Westside Barbell method. You've got to use your special exercises in plyometrics, in your bodybuilding exercises, and this particular close friend of mine at the time he wasn't doing any plyometrics, and I said, look, it's up to you, but I'd start including some jumps. He included jumps, and then about 3 or 4 weeks later, he'd hit a new PR. He got used to lifting the weights. He trained his body to lift slow, which was great for powerlifting. Yeah, that would suit powerlifters, strongmen. But when it comes to a speed strength sport like Olympic lifting, you need that fast twitch, you need that power, as well as being able to lift slow and heavy. You need to balance both. And unfortunately, he'd hit one side of the scale too hard, and his body got adjusted to lifting slow, and that's it. Until he started doing 60 to 80 jumps per week, and I told him to do all different variations of jumps. So he kind of looked back at that, and he spoke to his coach and gave his coach feedback and said, I want plyometrics as part of his program, because the rest of his program was great. It was just missing a few little things. And then, yeah, my own progression and journey, I've dipped in and out of Westside Barbell training in terms of getting ready for competitions. So if I'm getting ready for competitions, I tend to pull away from the Westside Barbell style of training just so I can get in the volume that CrossFit requires, and I can get in the metcons and the conditioning side of things. Now, when it comes to conditioning, you don't lose conditioning necessarily through Westside Barbell training. If you're doing it correctly, that is. And some people don't do Westside Barbell training correctly. And they're going to say in the comments, well, Craig, I've done Westside Barbell raw and it didn't work for me. But I'd argue, well, you've probably gone wrong somewhere in the methodology, whether that be you taking too long of a rest time. So Louie would have his athletes, not his powerlifters, I'd say his athletes, wrestlers. He used to have a lot of wrestlers in. I would say it was anywhere between 30 seconds to 45 seconds per round, and they could be doing 3-minute rounds in the belt squat with grappling, so keeping the GPP related to SPP. And yeah, I found that once I converted from one style of training, being Westside Barbell, into specific CrossFit training, my conditioning wasn't that bad. It would take a matter of a couple of weeks to get back where I was before I stopped doing any sort of large amounts of volume or metcons, which if you listen to Matt Fraser and his podcasts and his comments in the past, that if he needed to work on a specific weakness, he would tone down certain things. He wouldn't stop them altogether, but he would tone down certain things in order to hone in and be laser focused into what it is he's got to do to improve his weakness. And I agree with that. I think there's a large census in CrossFit sometimes within the community. And I get, for those that are doing an hour's class, say, they've got to fit so much volume and they've got to get so much work done in an hour. I get that, but these are elite athletes that are, some of them are training all day now and are sponsored to train. And I think Matt Fraser was saying that one of his keys to his success was basically volume and intensity management is the way I pick it up. Because if you wanted to increase strength and you're still doing 5 metcons a day, it's not that it's not possible. It's just a lot harder to A, keep the calories up, and B, really push that strength through the max, through the ceiling, by sort of churning out metcons left, right, and center, and having the off season and then ramping the up season up slowly, which is what Matt Fraser sort of, I would say, revolutionized in the CrossFit Games level. At that level, I don't mean national level, I mean on an international level. There are stories that I've watched and seen where I think he went to the Dubai Championships. No, sorry, a he'd gone to a sponsored event. Someone in the community might remind me of this. He'd gone to a sponsored event. It might have been a rogue event, and they had to do. I think they had to be fitness tested, and he'd not long come off season. He might have still been at college, and he'd not long come off season, and he'd done very to little to no conditioning. All the others were well conditioned. I think I want to say either Brooke Wells or I'm forgetting the other Icelandic. One of the Icelandic girls were there. It wasn't Sarah. It was Cara. I think it was Cara. David. Yeah, Cara. No, Katrin. Katrin. I think Katrin was there, and I think because her training is quite Metcon. Yeah, it was Katrin Davis' daughter. Her training was Metcon heavy, and she flew through the fitness tests, and you'll be able to find this on YouTube somewhere. Matt was struggling; he was nowhere near what he'd be. But what he was clever with was that that didn't mean anything. That fitness testing, it had just finished the off season, and the season was only just starting. So he knew in his periodization, in his plan, through his coach, was that he would climb his fitness through the year. That was his secret through the 5 years. That the 5 years that he won out of, I think, the seven, he came twice, came second twice. He would elevate his fitness across the year, so he would peak at the games. He wouldn't peak all year round because he's seen all the CrossFit athletes try to peak instantaneously, try to have unrealistic high endurance throughout across the whole 12 months of the season. He just knew his body wouldn't be able to handle it, and he just knew that he had to work smarter and not harder. Given that CrossFit athletes at that CrossFit Games athletes specifically at that level are already putting in the work anyway. So, and it worked for him. And I think Tia Toomey, she does the same. I know with her husband, who programmed for both of them at one point. Uh, still does the same. They still climbing waves in terms of if they need to peak for certain competitions, they'll ramp things up and they'll pick and choose when they want to climb things and when things are the big goals or the little goals, and that's what comes down to good coaching and good periodization and planning. So, in terms of going back to Westside Barbell, though, this is what Louie was great at. He was great at the science and the volume and the intensity of keeping your sessions 45 minutes to an hour, especially if you're a natural raw lifter, keeping your rest to 45 seconds to a minute so you can keep the conditioning in, especially if you're an athlete. If you were one of his big guys, even his big guys, they didn't have long to rest. It's not like bodybuilders, it's not like strongmen where some of them are having 3 to 5 minutes rest, which is why people I've heard sometimes say, "Oh, it doesn't work for raw lifters," and it's like, well, what are you training? Are you working this? Are you working that? Are you spending too long resting? So, for me personally, I have nothing but huge respect, and if I could thank Westside Barbell and what they put out still to this day, they still put journals out, they still sell their programs and machines thanks to Louis and what he left us. Um, a lot of them are not just for progression based, but a lot of them are for rehab based. And if you watch Westside versus the World, it goes into the rehab based stuff and the reasons why. So very very clever man, and left us with a lot of clever machines for the fitness world and the recovery world. So I thought, why not start with something very close to me, something very close to my fitness journey, and that is explaining the Westside Barbell methods for athletes. So just a quick summary, deep summary to finish. To remember that there's 2 max days, 2 dynamic days, repetition day. Making sure that you use, especially if you're an athlete, you use plyometrics. Making sure that it is a 3-week wave. because of law of accommodation. You don't want to repeat after 3 weeks of the same exercise, otherwise you start getting worse. Again, that's another thing that I've seen within close circles, which we touched on earlier in the podcast. So, I was trying to think what else. Making sure you pick and going away and having a look at what exercises would suit your weaknesses as well. There are hundreds and hundreds of different exercises, swapping them in and out. For Olympic lifters, an example would be to front squat to a box, to a low box in a wide stance. Another example would be for max effort day would be a power clean to a hang clean to a full clean. Again, that's another record. A max power snatch, a max hang snatch. A separate session can be a max split jerk, push jerk. So combining a few there. Then you got your classic lifts anyway, so you can count them as records, which is the goal to break. The dynamic days you want to work off 75%, 8%, 85% across the 3 weeks. Then you go back after the 85% to 75, and you start the wave again. Again, using the new variation of exercise to work on the speed. So for squatting, for example, if you've done wide box squat in the front squat position, on the dynamic day, in the first week you've run 75%, second week 8%, and then third week 85% on your dynamic day, and then again you swap out the variation for a different one. Is there anything else that we need to cover? I'm just trying to think. You're trying to keep it fresh. It's conjugate. Yeah, you're trying to keep the body shocked. The one thing I would say that I've not touched on in this podcast is something that Louie spoke about highly that really drove his athletes to increase their speed was using the term speed over centrics, which was resistant bands. Now, if you're in a global gym or a commercial gym, you've not really got any chance of being able to put bands over barbells and really forcing your body to get under a clean, for example, or really forcing your body to push through a squat with band tension. That's something I'd love to do. Maybe it's something we can work on in the future at a different gym that's local to me. But until then, it's not something that I include in my training. But again, it is on YouTube. There is a breakdown on Westside Barbell and how the different bands and different band tensions that you should be using for overcoming speed eccentrics. And as I've said many times, it's a science. It's about increasing force. You know, the formula for increasing force was found out by using originally it was the Westside had used chains way back in the 70s and 80s, and then resistant bands became a big thing. And one day Louis decided to put them over the barbells and never looked back, and it's given his gym still records to this day. So if it can work for his guys, it can work for anyone. So other than that, my strength continues to grow, and I continue to make records by using this style of training. I would highly encourage that you take a look into this style of training and adapt it into your own, try and fit it into your own, even if it's just little bits, even if it's just the rest periods or the different style of jumps and the special exercises, because there's so many things to touch on, and we can go on for another hour or two. But I am going to end this first podcast, this first episode here. Hopefully we can get more comments, more feedback on your thoughts of Westside Barbell. Let us know if you train the Westside Barbell method and if you continue to do it. Let me know what variations of exercises or exercises that you'd recommend. Put them in the comment section down below. Give this podcast a share and make sure you subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.